Kia ora koutou, no mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui o Manaaki Whenua, ko Joanne Dow, toku ingoa. I'm Principal Engagement Advisor here at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. Thanks so much for joining us today to learn about the work that our research team has been doing for the Ministry for the Environment to develop a land use classification framework for New Zealand. You're all on the call, so you'll understand and know how vital land use information is to understand the impacts of our land use on the environment, and also to understand what the most appropriate uses for different areas of land could be in the future, especially in the context of a changing climate. So it's fantastic to see this work underway in New Zealand, and it's great that the Ministry for the Environment has made this investment in building a framework. Richard Law will be presenting to us today. He's been working as a geospatial analyst in the informatics team at Manaaki Whenua for the last 5 years. And he has, from Manaaki Whenua and also his prior experience, he has expertise in geographic information systems and analysis and application development, as well as experience in econometric modelling and web development. There's a lot of information to get through today, so I will hand over to Richard very shortly, but just a couple of kind of notes and technical notes from me first. Given the interest in this topic and our desire to do it justice, we may run slightly over time with the questions today. The presentation will definitely be finished on time as always, but we may just go a little bit further with the discussion than we normally do. We promise we won't mind if you leave early, though. We understand that taking half an hour out of your day is a big call sometimes. To facilitate getting through the questions as efficiently as possible, there are a couple of other team members that have been involved in the work who are online as well, James Ardo and Lacey Harris, and they may also answer the questions online as we go. So please do pop your questions into the Q&A function as they occur to you. And do use the Q&A function rather than the chat, because the chat is disabled and the video and ability to unmute yourself is also disabled for everyone. If you want to, you can use the thumbs up signal on other people's Q&A in the Q&A function, so that can prioritise the order that we get to them online. And as always, we do take a note of all of the questions that are asked, whether we get to cover them orally or not, and we will respond to you and we'll post all of that information online afterwards. In case of any technical difficulty, feel free to send me a message directly on Teams. And I think that's it. So Richard, over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. So hopefully you've read the blurb and you'll understand that today we're going to consider a proposal for a land use classification system that is appropriate for New Zealand. New Zealand doesn't have a comprehensive land use classification framework, or perhaps what does exist is considered insufficient in some sense. Nationally, we have things like ratings valuations rules, which require the use of a standard set of classes defined in a particular standard. We have also proposed national planning standards from 2019, which includes the zone framework standard, that is standard names and definitions for council zones. We also have the Australian and New Zealand Standard Industrial Classification, ANZIC, which perhaps could be used as part of a land use application. Beyond that, we can consider things like hybrid land use land cover classifications like Lucas Lum, land cover maps like LCDV, and then at the regional level, we have inconsistent regional land use classifications, which are typically made in ad hoc fashion for applications for which existing national data and classification systems are apparently insufficient. Further than that, within particular domains, we have things, classifications such as beef and lamb farm classes and dairy and Z classifications for dairy farms. These examples are used by these organisations to aggregate information, publish statistics and so on. They are then dependent on downstream and various land use models, simply because that is the information that actually exists. MFE has contracted us to survey the existing land use classifications in New Zealand and also to hold workshops with users of land use information. On the basis of this review and these workshops, we were further contracted to develop a draft land use classification system. Alongside this process, we were to develop a plan for the future and meaningful engagement of Māori to ensure we will have a vision of land use classification that is genuinely appropriate for use in New Zealand. So to give an outline of today's presentation, the first question is to consider is, why do this again? What is inadequate about existing land use classification systems? On the right there is an image from a report written in 2008 showing an example of what's termed a multi-dimensional land use classification system as proposed by Daniel Rutledge and others listed there. That particular report didn't propose a classification system in itself, but it did consider the high-level organizational principles regarding what makes a good classification system. So we will therefore introduce a distinction between a land use classification framework and a land use classification system. A framework is higher level principles and best practices for the design of land use classification systems. The systems are more concrete realizations of organizational ideas around land use, including the systems of labeling. We will also consider the plan for Māori engagement. This has not yet been undertaken, but I want to discuss why it is critical to the success of this proposal. And then I'll move on to a proposal for a draft land use classification framework and system, including a brief tour of the principles and best practices of the framework, and then discuss aspects of our proposed land use classification system, including the class hierarchy and some definitions, as well as proposed data attributes beyond the classification hierarchy. There's a lot of detail there, so I can't go into the whole hierarchical system of classes, but we'll have a whirlwind tour of that, and we'll show you how you can get more involved and read some more. So that, what's next really is how you can collaborate and perhaps also an open discussion about possibilities for governance of land use information systems in New Zealand. So this old chestnut, why are land use classification systems unimplemented or unenduring? There's an example here on the left from Cumberland's proposed classification for use in New Zealand from 1944. That was 80 years ago. This is not a new problem, it's not a new question. In the interest of having more time to show our proposal, I won't spend time considering more examples like this, but there are many. However, it has to be noted that the usual practice of reviewing land use classifications is to conclude by recommending another land use classification. So we have to confront the obvious question: why? Is it that existing land use classification systems are inadequate? Do they have perhaps a poor definition of the unit of analysis? Do they lack clear diagnostic criteria? Do they have too few classes? Are they too generalized? Perhaps they are simply too difficult to implement. Are they too subjective? Do they have too many classes? Are they too technical? Is it that they are actually unnecessary? Are land cover classes a sufficient proxy for land use in most cases? Do we really just need better land cover maps, higher resolution, more time steps? Possibly more fundamentally, is it that we lack governance around land use classification systems? Do we need to mandate their use in particular applications? For instance, perhaps our most enduring land use classification is actually the classification used in the ratings valuations data because it's required to be used in the process of land valuation. In our review of existing classification systems, we came to a realization that there will always be competing land use classifications. One thing that may be important in making these competing systems come to life is a classification framework. This can be used to communicate the principles and best practices appropriate for any land use classification system that sits under that framework. The requirements and recommendations should be based on the collective national and international experience of producing land use information. That is to learn from the last 80 years and build on it, but hopefully not to repeat it ad nauseum. In contrast to a land use classification framework, a land use classification system is less abstract and includes a defined set of classes designed in a logical fashion, like this image here, ideally including diagnostic criteria for classifications. We still have to account for the enduring need for multiple land use classification systems, but we can attempt more coordination and the adoption of best practices. It's possible to imagine classification systems that are only applicable at specific spatial or temporal scales for limited contexts and for specific purposes, including the purposes of confidentiality and data sovereignty. Such systems can still attempt to adhere to established best practices. That is why we wanted to do more than propose another classification hierarchy. So we'll move now to our proposal for a land use classification framework. Our framework primarily consists of two lists, a list of principles for the framework itself, and then a list of best practices for land use classification systems that are derived from these principles. The 7 principles listed here, the link at the bottom of the slide, which my colleague will helpfully now place into the meeting chat, or Q&A, I suppose, will take you to GitHub, where we have the framework available to read in complete detail. If GitHub is unfamiliar, don't worry, because we've not created any code there. It's simply a set of text documents to read. The idea is that we wanted to put these ideas somewhere where people could comment on and review them and not just bury them in a report. I'll highlight just 2 of these principles now, but if you're interested in the others, go look at the GitHub or raise a question in the Q&A if you want to discuss a particular one, or alternatively read our report as well. The first principle, prioritize atomic data. That is to say, record small facts about land using more than one attribute field. Rather than, say, having a class for organic irrigated kiwifruit orchards, have a class for production, agricultural plantations, subclass perennial horticulture, subclass vine fruits. Independently of that class, record organic as a management practice and kiwifruit as a commodity. Is there a micro-irrigation system? Well, that could also be recorded as a management practice. This is just one example of the idea of separating the bits of information into different pieces rather than encapsulating multiple concepts into a single label. Principle 6, prioritize reproducible and transparent methodologies. Where it is appropriate to do so, i.e. considering privacy and principles of data sovereignty, classification systems should allow for their methodology to be independently verified. Transparency should increase trust and allow for the correction of errors. Less abstractly, we also propose a set of best practices. These are practices for those designing and maintaining land use classification systems. Again, I don't have time to discuss them all, but they are available for reading online. I'll highlight a few now. The first one, purpose. That is, land use classification systems shall describe their intended use cases. They might be general purpose, but even then, they usually have particular applications and an audience in mind for which the classification is particularly suitable, or others for which they are deemed to be explicitly unsuitable. 4, description of data quality. The quality of published land use data shall be described using a standard such as ISO 19157. This also implies that there is a formal process of validation and that the results of that process are then made available. This may reveal, for instance, that certain classes are known with greater error than other classes, according to the available information. 6, metadata. Land use datasets and classification schema should be published using established metadata standards. 10, provenance. Source information, such as the geographic scale of any input data, the date of that data, how old it is, if there is a human operator involved, the name of that operator, and that operator's confidence in the classification shall also be recorded. Part of this process of reflection on land use classification in the past and the future has been to develop a synthesis of perspectives on land use from a Te Ao Māori perspective. It is essential to the development of an enduring land use classification system for New Zealand that there is Māori participation, so that ultimately land use information meets the needs and priorities of Māori decision makers who are highly aware of and interested in the development of a national land use classification to inform Māori planning, policy, and decision making that cuts across social, cultural, environmental, and economic dimensions in much the same way that land use information does. 4 senior Māori researchers at Manaaki Whenua considered what meaningful and representative engagement with Māori organisations and individuals actually looks like. It involves using our Māori conceptual approaches to make collaboration and Māori input most effective. The proposed engagement has not yet taken place, but we know that overarching considerations at this point are flexibility and not rigidity, active participation and not passive observation or exclusion. Māori need to have their perspectives and knowledge embedded into the framework to meet the particular needs and priorities of Māori. It should not be limited to a single hui or workshop. It must be active and meaningful participation. So that is to say, how Māori are involved is important, not just that they are involved in some abstract sense. We know that the draft system as proposed is in this regard insufficient, since the engagement we have proposed has not yet been done. We are presenting, therefore, a starting point rather than a finishing line. We also propose ultimately that an expert Māori advisory group is convened to ensure that the land use classification framework is consistent with Māori priorities. They could also identify a broad set of attributes that are of interest to Māori decision makers, noting that the framework principle of extensibility was considered specifically so that Hapua Niue should be able to extend and adapt any classification system designed at a national level to be more relevant and specific to their interests and priorities. Now we'll move focus to the current draft proposal for a top-down land use classification system. This actually has 114 classes at the third level of the hierarchy. That'll be on the next slide, just warning you in advance. The classes are systematically enumerated and all are provided with definitions. The class hierarchy is influenced by, but significantly differs from, an Australian land use classification system, which we took as a helpful starting point. This system is called, the system we borrowed from, I should say, is called the Australian Land Use and Management Classification System version 8. We have quite significantly altered ALM, as it's referred to, but aspects of it that we considered valuable are retained, and in particular, the use of a controlled vocabulary of commodity types and management practices for agricultural and extractive industries was considered to be quite helpful. In contrast to the proposal here, the ALM system has 6 classes at the primary level, and we only propose these 3. We've attempted to take on board existing land use classification practice in New Zealand, purposes such as state of the environment, soil quality monitoring, the Waikato Integrated Scenario Explorer, WISE, LUDB, the New Zealand Planning Standards, and the LINS Ratings Valuations Rules. I want to say thanks to those who participated in our workshops. I'm sure many of you here today. We've attempted to bring your needs and perspectives into the design of this system. Here's the expanded view of the tertiary level of the classification, showing all 114 classes. This is proposed as a general purpose land use classification, but it definitely reflects ideas around grouping the nature of interaction of land use activities with the use of soil and water resources. So it's especially relevant for land use change modelling in the context of environmental management. Land can be used for more than one thing, and we propose classifying land according to its primary use, which is to be based, in theory, on the opinion of the primary land management objective of landowners or land managers. Additional ancillary land uses can still be captured separately. And because some classes are probably only ever secondary uses, they still need to be recorded here, even if they may not be primary uses of land. There is a data structure associated with this classification, which also builds on ALM's example. It includes further detail, following the principle of the atomicity of information, including a relatively rudimentary form of provenance information. Because one particular piece of feedback from the workshops was that users need to know how the classification for land is actually determined. At the same time, it's a bit of a trade-off because it can be complex to express that information systematically. There is no way I can go through all of these classes within a 20-minute presentation, so I'll just briefly show the nature of the definitions we have included for each class. This is the definition for the primary class 2, production, agriculture, and plantations. Now I'll just read a single sentence from here. The range of activities in this category includes plantation forests, pasture production for stock, cropping and fodder production, and a wide range of horticultural production. Again, these are available to read online. If we narrow our focus to class 2.1, plantation forests, then there is a narrower definition. Again, reading a small excerpt from this. This is land on which plantations of trees or shrubs, native or exotic species, have been established, i.e. planted, for production or environmental and resource protection purposes. There are 5 further child classes in this case, unfortunately named A to E, but realistically 2.1.1 to 2.1.5, which you can see here. This numbering system is just produced automatically. It's not correct. It should be numerical. If we step sideways to the class 2.2, the sibling of class 2.1, grazing modified pasture systems, we have another major class that many of you will be interested in. This particular class attempts to deal with the difficulty of interannual changes that aren't land use changes per se, but are rather rotational management practices within a coherent land use. This is an example of the difficulty of designing a land use classification system, considering temporality in terms of what occurs and when, and while we also need the principles and best practices to help guide us in terms of what we should do when dealing with the complexities of land use around us. In addition to the systematic hierarchical organization of classes and following the principle of atomicity of information, and again also following Alam's example, we propose some additional attributes that can be recorded against land. These will help to further discriminate land, but it must be recognized that a lot of this information will only be available in an ad hoc fashion in reality. Attribute and commodity information comes from Alam. That's his first two, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the first two lines in this table. And they should use a controlled vocabulary so that end users can all discriminate, say, types of forestry activities in the same manner and not have to deal with 100 different ways of describing a forestry practice, for instance. We also propose to include other attributes such as tenure and to record council zones and potentially even land cover at the time of mapping. Although these are not strictly land use, they are very clearly associated to it, and they are critical for effective use of the land use information. We do not propose a dedicated class for water features, you may have noticed that, but rather instead propose that water features and also permeability to water are recorded as attributes. In such a way, there would be the ability to record whether water is quite used within the context, say, of conservation class or on a pasture grazing system, or even if it's part of the built environment, an urban stream, for example. Last year, Manaaki Whenua was engaged in developing a regional land use map for Northland. We've done many of these over the years, but this is the most recent. In the absence of a national classification system like the one we have proposed, we experimented with adopting the Australian system directly. Not without its criticism, it was nevertheless quite helpful. There is a report where you can read more about this, and you can explore this open data too. James, if you pop a link into the Q&A so people can have a look at that at their leisure as well. The point of showing this particular slide is only to demonstrate this data structure here. The nature of the information that we are proposing, which goes beyond a single land use class, in this case 3.2, again it's using a different system, but it goes beyond that single label of a class on a parcel of land to also include things like the source data, operator confidence in the classification, commodity descriptions, comments, and so on. There's more information available in this data set than what is shown in this small snapshot, but the point is that it's not just the class, there's additional information that needs to be recorded. And that's what we're proposing in this case. The Australians are worth considering because they have a mature governance arrangement around their system of land use information. The development of the ALM system is actually led by a consortium of organisations with interests in land use information. There's an outfit called ABARES, I hope that's how they pronounce their acronym. I think it's the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Resource Economics, and I've forgotten the acronym, apologies, but ABARES is responsible for developing their standard of land use information, including protocols for the collection and validation of such information. They use automated techniques to publish a reasonably low resolution national land use map, but then critically, they also coordinate across state governments to produce higher resolution versions of a continental scale land use map. ABARES has a role validating the information that's produced at the state level, and then they aggregate, combine, and publish the information and make it available via web services for people to use. This is a similar view of the same map, but actually shows the state level information rather than the national map, which is more precise than the previous map, but less temporally consistent as state governments have some limited latitude with respect to how and when they provide this land use information to abares. This is a summary showing only 18 classes. The full version has around 200 classes at the third level, so there's quite a bit of detail that's sort of hidden away in this summary map. This map, for instance, shows the available commodity information, such as, again, in a summary view. So this is animals in the brown, and you've got a list here of commodities on the left. This is prepared at the state level as an optional attribute. It was, in fact, only added as a possibility to the land use classification system standard in the most recent version, which was agreed upon in 2018. And the point of this is to demonstrate how their governance arrangements have allowed for considered pragmatic, useful, and backwards compatible improvement to their standard for land use classification over time. It's not a one and done, proposal. It's a living standard, and I think it's something that we ought to aspire to. It is also possible to see some metadata. This is a map of when land was last mapped, which is useful information for end users and shows that it's not always necessary to conduct continental scale revisions all at the same time, but rather to do things progressively. They also produce maps of tenure, which I think is also quite helpful. Due to the standardization and stability of the land use classification system, it has allowed abares and others to develop things like dashboards, an example here, and also modeling software that actually become even more useful over time as we get that time series record of land use over time. I'm not going to dwell on these now, but if you search Habari, you can find more about how this operates in Australia. So I hope this has been a helpful summary of our recent deep dive into the practice of land use classification in New Zealand. It's obviously quite brief. There's much more detail available online and in the report. But what we have done is to propose a starting point classification system. This is not the end, and we sincerely hope, first of all, that our engagement plan for Māori is realised. But more broadly, I want to put the question out there: how should we govern land use information? It is simply too important to be left to a single agency. And this is an open question to you all. I don't have an answer for this now. It's something that I want us to consider collectively. For the time being, however, I'd like to invite you to collaborate on the classification framework and system, give honest and public feedback on what's good and what's bad. And you could do that via the GitHub link or by sending an email to our dedicated land use email at Manaaki Whenua, which will be put into the chat, or by otherwise remaining engaged with future activities, which I'm sure will appear on the horizon. So hopefully I'm not over time, and we've got some time for some robust Q&A.
Apai, kia ora. Thanks so much, Richard. We don't have much time left at all for people who need to drop off after the 30 minutes is up, but there are lots and lots of questions. So with your indulgence, I am just going to give us a bit more time. But as I said before, people who need to leave, please go ahead. If you've asked a question, I can't promise that we will get to it in the next 15 minutes because there are quite a lot. And apologies because the Q&A function seems to work for some people and not for others, and we have no idea why. So Tiffany Day has set up a Mentimeter and emailed the link to everyone that is on the call. So if you have a question that you want to put in there to make sure we capture the question, please go ahead and do that, because as I said before, we'll follow up afterwards. For now, though, I'm just looking at all the questions flooding in, and I'm thinking I'm going to go with the simple one that's in the Q&A function on Teams, which has a few thumbs up, which is, Tēnā koe, Richard, do you foresee models like Te Kahuiraranga's Māori data governance might be a helpful lens for this work? Are there frameworks already in place for guiding this? Not sure if that's something you can speak to right now.
I have read a report on Māori data sovereignty. I'm not sure if that's the one that's being referred to, because I don't remember what it was called. Might be a helpful lens for the work. Absolutely. I think there's definitely, and this is why I say it's not enough to just propose a system and then mandate its use. There'll always be a role for localizing land use classification systems in particular places, and whether that's for iwi and hapu or for even industry groups. that's fine. And because a part of that's going to be, this is sort of one side of the coin. The other side of the, one side of the coin is how we classify information. The other side is, well, what data do we use? And particularly in the space of Māori data sovereignty, a lot of that data is going to remain and needs to remain controlled by hapu and iwi. So this is something that I guess can be adopted by, but it's not going to be something that's it can never, because of that data sovereignty issue, can never be something that's going to consume that information and present it back nationally. It's going to be something that can be applied nationally, but it can also be adapted and applied in place, if that makes sense. I hope that sort of addresses that question.
Great, yeah, thanks, Richard. There's quite a few questions that I can see from Mentimeter regarding privacy and data provenance. And I don't think I'm going to go with those ones first because they're going to be really complicated. So I'm going to choose some of the simpler ones, well, that seem simpler to me anyway. And the first one that jumps to me is, I'm not seeing any information that would be useful for contaminated land management, land uses associated with persistent pesticides, cadmium accumulation, and so on. Do you have any response to that? Is there any way that you can see that could be built in?
It's a great piece of feedback. Yep, that's exactly the kind of feedback we want to hear. And if you can perhaps use the GitHub to create an issue and open a discussion about this kind of thing. The way I would suggest approaching that, if we were to sort of have a light touch to our proposal, would be to say, let's expand our idea of management practices to include the use of pesticides, or the inclusion of the is it hail? I've forgotten the name of the hazarded, the list of contaminated land, which is available for, I think, all councils. That could perhaps be an additional attribute, because it's one thing to say this is how something is used now. It's another thing to say, but in the past it was used in a different way that resulted in contaminated land. And if that's useful information to people, then perhaps we need to consider how to describe and include that.
Right, thank you. Important issue. Another interesting issue, seems complex to me, but I'm interested in your thoughts, is could be nationally important to have something about carbon storage in there as well, whether it's above or below ground. Is that something that you can see could be added in due course, potentially?
And the answer to these questions is always yes, but also no, in the sense that ultimately you can funnel more and more information into a system, but it also makes it more and more complicated. At some point we've got to, I'm not picking on this particular carbon storage thing in particular, but at some point you've got to say this is a simplification of reality. It's only part of the possible information that exists. But this is why we propose this idea of a classification framework. If we can think of more specific applications, then let's create a second one that's more focused on this particular application. And it can still say, and I'm going to publish this in a way that is compliant with the framework. It's going to include metadata. It's going to be validated in the same way as other classification systems. Because it's simply not possible to create a system that is going to be acceptable to every single use case, because every single use case is different, and in some in a more fundamental way than others.
Yeah.
But let's think about the big picture. I mean, this is one proposal for a slice. We hope that it's it's kind of like, doing the 80-20 problem. You try and hit a general purpose classification tries to hit 80% of use cases, but the last 20 are going to be so particular that to try and expand the system to include them would just pull it to breaking point. But if you can,
so you want to keep it so that it's focused on delivering to its primary purposes for the majority audience, and not making it so complicated that it's just not user friendly anymore. I hear what you're saying.
And we've called it general purpose, but really that's a misnomer, because it really depends on our perspective of what general means.
Yeah, and as you say, a separate system could be constructed for those other layers of information in a different place, so that it doesn't complicate things for the primary users and audience. There's an interesting comment here, which is great, which I'll note. Just a comment, when you begin your Māori engagement work, please feel free to get in touch with our team, the Māori Agribusiness team at MPI. So you were probably all already thinking of that, but it's great to have that noted in there. Thank you. That was from Mentimeter. Another one from the Teams Q&A function. Kia ora, Richard. LCDB is the basis for the threatened environments classification, which is valuable for prioritising land use and ecological restoration. Will the new land use classification be a more accurate basis for classifying threatened environments?
I'm not a domain expert in this, so perhaps someone's got a better answer, but this is not to replace LCDB. LCDB will still exist. And LCDB has its own development pathway in terms of future improvements. So I'm not going to say whether it's more accurate or not. It's a different thing. They may be useful together. I suspect they definitely will be, because cover and land use are related but distinct. So hopefully it helps to do your work better. But again, it's not going to replace LCDB. LCDB will still exist. Okay,
great. Now I'm going to ask this one because I think it is something you've considered already, so it could be a quick one. Regarding urban attributes and zoning, I could not see mixed use zoning. If not, I'd recommend adding this.
This is a sticky point, and this is comes back to some of the best practices for land use classifications. How do you more generally record multiple uses, right? There's mixed use in urban spaces for sure, how apartments over shops, but you've also got it on farms. You've got forestry blocks on sheep and beef farms. You've got people running beehives on their land. Whatever it is, there is always going to be some level of mixed use going on all over the place. And the question is, well, how do you record that in a way that is still simple to use? So for this particular classification, we propose identifying a primary use, but also having a way to record ancillary or secondary uses alongside that. And so the distinction of how that's made is difficult, of course, because how do you say what is the primary use, particularly in urban areas where you've got a retail layer on the ground floor and then perhaps apartments and offices above. But there definitely needs to be a way to record multiple uses, because you can't just simplify that away and say it doesn't happen. And saying that something is mixed use then begs the question, well, what are the mixes? And we actually have this problem already in the ratings data land use standard, which has classes for, let's say, residential and commercial. I forget the names of them exactly. And then they've got mixed, and just says mixed, and you don't know what it's a mix of. And that's a problem. So
could you potentially create some new categories that blend the most common mixed uses and make it such that if people want to look only at a particular land use, the mixed uses come up as well as the sole uses?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, again, this comes back to the governance idea, is we need to develop a consensus about how to do it. If there is what's the expression? There's many ways to skin the cat. So coming to an agreement about how we do it is important. But we definitely need to consider mixed uses because it's very important.
Okay, great. There's still so many questions pouring in, so I'm being a bit kind of just picky, or not picky, a bit indiscriminate rather. There was one I saw about mining. Yes, why is mining included in the built environment section when it's generally considered an activity that occurs in rural areas and doesn't necessarily include a large percentage of buildings?
Is it? Possibly is. I can't remember that much detail of the system, unfortunately. Again, something we can discuss, something we can change. We haven't published data to the system yet, so if there are glaring oddities like that, then we ought to address them.
Yeah.
I can't particularly remember the justification for that particular organisation.
Yeah. Is that something that would be useful to have in the GitHub as well, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yep.
Right.
We're fallible. We can make mistakes too. Please help us correct them.
Yeah. Team effort. Excellent. There's a question here about whether recording will be made available. Definitely, the recording will be available as with the presentation and a copy of all of the unanswered questions and answers to those questions. Recognising that land use changes over time, how will the information be kept up to date?
That's a good question, right? Particularly if you allow for the possibility of changing the classification structure and system over time, does that make it harder to use? Say if we publish land use data for this year, and then 5 years' time we've got a different system in use, and it's no longer compatible. There needs to be some weight placed on ensuring backwards compatibility. It shouldn't be a light matter to say moving mining from class 3 to class 2. That should be something that should be considered and done quite deliberately, because it damages backwards compatibility. This is a problem we have all over the place with any classification system. LCDB's gone through several versions that, as far as I understand, have been relatively painful in terms of doing that, and this is something that needs to be considered. I mean, there's a practical dimension too, as to how, if you then take the system and produce some data that adheres to the system, perhaps you should do it in a way that's reproducible, such that if the classification system changes in 5 years, you can go back in time and reuse the old data to develop a map to the new standard. But these are wider questions around how this is done as a practice, rather than questions around the classification system itself.
Great, thank you. Hopefully a quick one. Is this work being done alongside the ecosystem typology also conducted by Manaaki Whenua? How could the data be integrated? And I'm asking that because I'm curious as well. I haven't heard about that in any of the discussions we've had internally. Maybe it was a thorny one. Sorry.
Yeah, there's lots of things going on. I'm not aware of all of them. How can they be integrated is an interesting question, and potentially quite a technical one, because it could come down to things like standards about what we term in the land use classification space as a geographic unit. The object of your classification. Are you classifying parcels, property parcels? Are you classifying, say, small units of watersheds? Are you classifying just homogeneous places of land that are next to each other? Or are you classifying, let's say, raster cells? And if you're classifying raster cells, are they the same grid specification as someone else, so that when you can align them to do some novel kind of analysis that combines two different threads? And you get this problem all the time when you try to combine, say, LCD of something else, and the boundaries aren't going to align. So there's a technical discussion there, and others here might have heard me talk in the past about using a discrete global grid system. That's something that I think is worth considering, but it's also not something that is probably worth discussing right now, because it is quite technical. But I think that's kind of a technical problem that requires a technical solution about how to integrate across data sets. Yeah.
Right, okay, thank you. This one I think should have a relatively simple answer. I'm sure you've already considered it. At what resolution do you expect the land use classification data to be available? And do you anticipate any issues obtaining data at that high resolution on the national scale?
So I think the first point is to reiterate that we're not proposing producing any data at this point. We're proposing merely a data structure and a classification system that helps us to organize our, I guess, principles of grouping things together. It's, in quite an abstract sense. There is definitely a parallel discussion about then how do you implement these ideas. And in terms of the resolution, ultimately it just comes down to you can't magic away poor resolution inputs. And if you're still constrained by the available data, and this is part of the discussion that needs to go forward, is we can design this amazing classification system and then later come to realize we don't have sufficient data to actually put it into practice. And that is helpful. That's helpful information, because then we can say, okay, let's rally behind, let's get some funding to find out about forestry in better detail than we do now, because the scale of LCDB at 1 to 50,000 is insufficient for what we want to do. And if that's the case, then we know it and we've got justification for it, and we can hopefully address it as a group. But this particular classification doesn't really speak to the appropriate resolution. I anticipate that this classification is suitable at the property scale and sub-parcel scale to an extent, certainly property scale, because you can imagine, forestry blocks on farms, or you can imagine, I don't know, parking is distinct from the shopping mall. Though that kind of scale, there's obviously a limit there, but it really depends on the input information available, and that is something that will change over time. And it will change faster than the classification scheme itself should probably change.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much, Richard. You've done really well. And yeah, going a little bit longer than we normally do, and we've covered a lot of questions. Some of them I think we might still include in the write-up, because people will have dropped off the call and the discussion has been really rich and useful. As I said before, everyone, this information will all be loaded onto the website, and we will email you the link so you have a copy of the recording of the presentation and of the unanswered questions with written answers. And we'll share that with you all as soon as possible. There's lots of questions, so that may take a bit longer than usual. And the next seminar is going to be kind of related to land use as well, and that's going to be at the end of August. So please keep an eye out on your inbox for the invite for that one. And with that, I will wish everyone a great day. Kia pai te rā, kia koutou. Nau mai, haere mai, thank you very much for joining us again. We'll see you next time. Kia ora.